Hello, my name is Caitlin Rose Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan. You are at Session 10, a case study on native plant selection. This is a case study, so you're coming into this unmuted, and we're going to ask you to mute yourself. We will start with a short presentation, break out into groups, and then you'll get your virtual hands dirty where you can unmute yourself and discuss with the group with your webcams on. So before we begin, I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. So today, Brianna Nichols will be leading us through a case study. Brianna has completed a diploma in renewable resource management and a certificate in fish and wildlife technology in Lethbridge, Alberta, as well as a bachelor in environmental studies from the University of Manitoba. She also completed her Manitoba Arborist certificate. She has 10 years of experience contributing to the preservation and restoration of native landscapes throughout southern Manitoba and with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, the City of Winnipeg, Naturalist Services, and currently is a terrestrial ecologist at Native Plant Solutions. So when not collecting native forb seeds or crunching data on pollinators, Brianna can be found at the cabin or in a dance studio. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to you, Brianna.
Thank you very much. I'm just getting going there. It's good? Good. Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today to this presentation. Hopefully it answers some questions that you might have about native plants and how to use them and where. I think, Caitlin, I sent along a poll just to get a little bit of an idea of where people are coming from and how they're planning on using native plants, and that way we can kind of tailor the discussion a little bit better towards what it is that you're looking for out of plants, because it's quite varied. So maybe Caitlin can send that along. There we go. So question is, where will you be incorporating your plants? So that's urban parks or green spaces, reclaimed project sites, large scale prairie restorations, or a little bit of all three. So I'm a little bit of all three. Put that in there. And then once we kind of get some answers, Caitlin will provide those to us. So while we're waiting on that, I'll just go over kind of the outline for the presentation today. So I'll provide a little bit of background just on what NPS does and the work that I do with them. And I'm just going to put a timer on so I make sure that I don't talk for 16 hours because I really like plants and it's possible that I will do that. Then I'll go over some of the design process steps and what makes a project successful or not successful. And then I'm going to provide some project examples. So we're going to work through two fine scale projects. They're really small, but I was really involved in them from the conception to the finish. And then highlighting some species. I can never pick which one's my favorite, so you can't ask that question. But there's some species that I like to ensure that I try to include in every project, and those are the some that I'm going to list. So a little bit of, here we go. So we got the poll back. So most of you, 50% of you are on reclaimed project sites, 19 are a little bit of all three, 14% urban parks or green spaces, and then large scale prairie restorations, we have 26%. So reclaimed project sites is the winner here. So that means we kind of gotta make sure that when I'm looking at these plants, it's from a tool perspective, not necessarily from a flowering perspective, which is fine. So NPS, if you're unfamiliar with us, was started as a consulting branch of Ducks Unlimited, formed in 2001. So we specialize in native plant establishment and offer a diverse array of products to our clients. So this includes restoration, reclaiming natural landscapes, providing consulting services and biodiversity inventorying or biological health assessments. And that's really where I come in. So I am a terrestrial ecologist. Usually when you think of Ducks Unlimited, you associate rubber boots. I only wear rubber boots if I'm walking in a puddle. So I really work primarily from a wet meadow zone up until dry prairie. NPS, we have two kind of home offices, one in Winnipeg and then one in Edmonton. So we do a lot of work in and around Winnipeg. So primarily in the Interlake and the Tallgrass Prairie, but a lot in the urban zones. So we're in a lot of new developments in Winnipeg. We do a lot of stormwater retention pond work. We divide our projects primarily to wetland and upland and riparian. And that just means that we're working in the stormwater retention ponds or naturalized sewage lagoons and or kind of decorative upland projects, which some of them we'll discuss, but we do work across Canada. So whether or not that's providing consultations or doing wetland restoration work or upland restoration work across Canada. So I'm going to do a quick overview of the design process and kind of what's involved from a perspective of being at the desk and in the field. So even though we're kind of tailoring this to just making the species list, there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into making that species list. So primarily the first couple steps are your project management and your site investigation. So these are continually happening. So project management includes your budget, equipment monitoring, making sure that staff know what they're doing and that you have enough staff. Your site investigation is stuff like when you're working on an active construction site, things are constantly changing. So is your access going to change? Is your drainage going to change? Are there plans to plant trees that will now change the way that you have to go about seeding? Then there's developing your species list, which is the highlight of this presentation. There's the installation, and then there's maintenance and monitoring. And arguably, maintenance and monitoring is more important than almost anything else on this list, because without adequate maintenance and monitoring, these projects are likely to fail. And that's just, you've wasted a lot of energy in the previous 4 steps if you don't have a really good maintenance and monitoring program. So I've kind of tried to lump up making up your species list into these 3 categories. So there's the site management, the site conditions, and then the species information. So your site management includes stuff like your budget, water and logistics, public perception, and site access. So these things can change. So sometimes grants are given and grants are taken away, so your budget can change. Water and logistics change if access changes on site, and then public perception changes depending on how they are feeling that day. And that can change from the morning to the afternoon just based on who's walking by and when. And then, like I said, site access, sometimes you can get in there with trucks, sometimes you can get in with quads, sometimes you can only get in there with your 2 feet. The site conditions are what the site provides to you. So that's your sunlight, your drainage. You look at the historical use of the site. So if you're on a reclaimed site, whether that means that there's soil contaminants or compacted soils that you'll have to address. Then there's your soil type. There's wind exposure, which can cause erosion, which can wipe away any fertilizer you put down. Then there's, or can affect your spraying. Client expectations, which I've lumped into site conditions because they have an expectation of what the site is going to look like throughout the process, and you have to keep that in mind. And then there's anthropogenic influences, which I refer to in this capacity, meaning are people walking through the site? Is there garbage being dumped? Are people putting their yard waste on your site? If it's a large reclaimed site, are dogs walking through there? Are there places that are marked off that you can't access? That kind of thing. And there's the species information. So depending on the scale of your project, you include more or less of these. So this is the most finicky you can kind of get about it. So, and you'll see that in one of the project examples, that all of these variables were considered in creating the species list. In some of our larger projects, because you have a lot of variability on the site itself, you don't have to be as considered with these fine details. So this first example is a residential house, Todd Drive in Winnipeg. So it's a typical residential yard. There's neighbors directly adjacent to the house. The river, Red River, is in the backyard. At this site, watering was feasible because they have hose taps on the side of the house. We just had to provide the staff and the time to do so, but they paid the water bill. There's direct access because the road is right there. You can get it on the driveway. So it's a small, finite, really easily managed area. The conditions, so previous to the house being built, it was just an empty yard, really full south-facing sun. Everything drains down to the street or away to the river, so there's not much moisture retention. Essentially, all the client wanted was just to have something that they didn't need to mow. And the only real historical use that we had to pay attention to on this site was, you'll see in the top right-hand corner of that picture above, which is just from Google Earth, you'll see a driveway. So already you're kind of aware that there might have been oil that leaked or gasoline, and then compacted soils, salt from them on the tires. So just aware that that area is there. Then in the bottom, you'll see that it was just field soil and there was some annual weeds that were on site. So we take control of our weeds, so we spray those out, and then we amend and put on some topsoil, or kind of a soil amendment that will make soil moisture retention easier instead of just draining right out of this. So when I go to a project and I'm thinking about how we're going to vegetate it, the first thing that goes through our mind is whether or not we're using seeds or if we're using plants. For this site, we chose seeds, and that was for forbs and for grasses. So we order in seed from a variety of sources, and we also harvest our own wildflower seeds, but we also purchase those. So it's a good mix of where we can get our sources from. Then what is available. So I try not to exclude anything right off of the bat. So when I'm looking at my species list and what I have, I don't say I'm never putting hyssop in something, or that I always avoid using yarrow because it's weedy. I say that this plant won't do well on this site, so that's what I take out. So we try to do more diverse on these kinds of projects because diversity will help with weed control in the long term, and with ensuring that you don't get that buildup of thatch. So then we break, because this was a yard, we wanted a little bit of a landscaping finish to it. So we wanted to make some zones. So we defined 3 different zones. So there was an edge, a low kind of mid-grow mix, and then a tall grass mix. And then once we kind of figure those out, then we define the rates. So here you'll see where the 3 zones went to. That tall mix is in that little yellow squiggle. The edge mix is where you see our erosion control blanket. And then the mid-grow mix went in everywhere else. So we kept the tall mix kind of smaller because big blue stem's big, and didn't want it to really overshadow everything else that was in the project. So designing a species mix for something like this, I think it's really important to build things like a pyramid, and you have to have a good framework. So instead of, there's the concept of succession, and that, you know, big blue stem, if you seed it naturally, only can grow from seed and produce seed in its 3rd or 4th year, depending on conditions. So we put in these grasses as the framework, and then add and adjust rates or forbs into this mix once we decide what we want. So these are kinds of things we look for. You know, buffalo, side oats, and blue grama are low growing, sort of early season flowering, except for buffalo, which kind of flowers when it wants to. And they like really dry prairie conditions, really pretty. Then our June grass is the low to the mid height. So it's not as short, but it's still not as tall. But I mean, so in Winnipeg, it's tall grass prairie. So big blue stem is my tall grass, which is 5 feet, which is as tall as I am. So that's what I mean by tall. So June grasses are mid-growing. It's early flowering, gets that really silver green gold, starts as a dense bunch grass, really showy. And what I really like about June grass is it changes through the season. Then your mid-growing, early flowering or your green needle and your western wheatgrass. The wheatgrasses are really good to put in at the beginning of a project because they are so adaptable and they are quick to grow, they're quick to spread. Unlike a lot of our dense bunch grasses, these guys can fill in the gaps, which is important. And on wheatgrass especially, it reseeds easily. So then one of the more showy ones that we love to add is little blue stem, because it's a late flowering species. Again, grows really well from seed, tolerates really dry conditions and really rocky conditions. So if you don't have a particularly nice, rich prairie soils, this guy will do fine. And of course, it's one of the most diverse in its coloring. So then we fill in gaps. So for the tall grass mix, we added an additional 8 forbs, and I think we had 10 or 11 grasses in total in the tall grass mix. Our mid-grow mix, we added 8 forbs in. And then on the edge mix, there was 9 forbs, all different. The edge mix, we went with some stuff that can tolerate a little bit more damage, considering that it was right along the driveway and the homeowner was putting salt down to make sure she wouldn't slip and fall, which makes sense, and you're in Manitoba, so snow and ice is inevitable. So that was stuff like we used Black-Eyed Susan's Dotted Blazing Star, which is the counterpart to Meadow Blazing Star. Dotted Blazing Star tolerates a lot more soil conditions than the Meadow Blazing Star. Grows smaller, is really, really attractive for pollinators. We use purple prairie clover and white prairie clover, flax and yarrow, and then a couple others, but that's how we address that. So this is the project in 1 year. So it was seeded on June 23rd. This was the site. The middle one is August 4th and then September 7th. The big management that has to get done in your first year is weed control. So we did 3 large weed pulling events. So we just hand pulled, but you have to time that appropriately, because if you do it too early, then you're ripping out any of your forbs or grass seedlings. And it's also harder to identify the plants. And when we're getting like seasonal staff to do this, you have to make sure that they know what they're doing. So that's critical. So you make sure that the plants, the weeds are big enough that you can identify them, but that they're not going to seed, and then you pull them. And so that happened a couple times over the summer. And like I said, we were able to water this site, which was important. And then you see the bottom right-hand corner of that September 7th photo, that yellowing spot was where the driveway was. So there is still residual effects, even though we put amended soil on there. In terms of long-term management on this site, she basically didn't want to mow this like a traditional yard would be mowed. So a burn is preferred. Whether or not she will be open to that when the time comes, we don't know. But that's the best method for management here. If not, it'll be raking and removing the thatch layer on a semi-regular basis. But we'll kind of check in with her occasionally to see how things are going, also just for interest's sake. So this next example is the Richardson Plaza, downtown Winnipeg. So you've likely seen it on the news at some point in time. It's a pretty famous intersection, very public, has been continuously used for a long time, but very busy. So you can imagine that we were kind of constantly dealing with people on site and parking and those kind of things. So the site conditions here, pretty restricted sunlight because there's buildings all around. But that being said, there was windows that was reflecting light, and then there's the radiant heat that's absorbed by the concrete. The planters themselves really only show a foot above ground, but they go down a lot deeper, so they are insulated by the surrounding building. We used field soil, so nothing special here. We didn't put an amendment on top because it would blow away when we were installing the planters here. So we had to bring in the dirt. It took us 3 days of wheelbarrowing, and some of our plywood was blowing away. Our plywood sheets were blowing away because it was that windy. So in terms of historical use on this site, there wasn't so much contaminants that we were concerned with, but it was the historical use of the site was definitely part of the decision-making process. So this is Winnipeg in 1883, obviously the bigger picture. Where the Davis House is now is a parking lot, and essentially the Cable Hotel is where the Richardson building is now. So for me, it was pretty important to make this a really powerful presentation of prairie plants, because 139 years at least that, I mean, you can't see any big blue stem. I doubt there's prairie crocus flowering. It's muddy and it's yucky. So it was pretty important to me that people became more familiar with these plants, and they were brought back to where they were originally. So all in all, what ended up being in there is there's 57 different species. So there's 14 different species of grasses and 43 different forbs. And designing these planters was a pretty complicated process. So there is 11 in all, 11 planters. This is an example of one of them. So on this side of the building, it is quite shady. It's a little bit more insulated. The wind isn't as bad. So we figured on this side of the building, the moisture retention would be higher. So we went with more shadier and moisture loving species. So the planters themselves aren't that big, but you want to still showcase different heights of plants and have something flowering at all the times of the year. So Canada Wild Rye is like the main focus on this one. Grows quite tall, flowers gold in the fall. And then your golden Alexanders are the flowering species that flower July. They're also quite tall. Yarrow and smooth aster are the early succession, easy, spread like crazy.
Hello, can I speak to Dana, please?
That we put in there. Wheatgrass is currently, it's not in there right now. The idea was that it would have to get planted in its second year, so that the rest of these plants could establish and get growing before sweetgrass kind of filled in all those gaps. So, but again, sweetgrass was important to put into this project because of the cultural significance. So it's pretty essential that it gets in there. Alum root is not a particularly showy species, but what it has going for it is that it has a nice basal leaf. So it will take up a lot of space early in the season and keep weeds out. So it's building, it's filling in those gaps. The Canada Wild Rye will spread, smooth aster will spread easily. The golden Alexanders are less likely to spread aggressively, but that's okay. And then the yarrow will also spread aggressively, but because it's fighting with the sweetgrass and the smooth aster for that available space, they'll kind of keep each other in check. So that's how one gets planted. And you can imagine that this took quite a lot of effort on our part to figure out which plants were going to go where and how many. This is one of the planters. This is one of my favorite ones. This was planted May 27th of this year. And then this was July 29th. So kind of in the max of growing potential. We were in a drought this year, so that presented challenges. But this planter has some pretty aggressive growing plants, and I really wanted to show this one because you don't have to force species out based on their aggressiveness or the behavior. You just have to find the right balance. So there's in the middle, there's New England aster, big blue stem, Indian grass, hyssop, and bergamot, which are generally quite bushy and aggressive species. On the outside, there is pearly everlasting, prairie crocus, some Canada violet, and northern bedstraw. So the northern bedstraw, the Canada violet, and the crocus are very early flowering species. So, and they have a very nice spreading capability. So they'll take up that space in the spring, and then once those guys kind of are done, then it's the middle tall stuff that will take their turn. Except the pearly everlasting, because that is everlasting and it will just look pretty all the time. So the idea is, again, that you're not omitting anything because of not liking it. You're just adjusting your planting plans based on being able to fit those niche layers and making sure that you have a good structure. Okay, so now we're going to go quickly through some species that I like to include on projects if I can, and that I think should be included more on a regular basis. Field pussy toes, you may or may not be familiar with them. This picture makes them look gigantic and really cool, but they are quite small. They are great because they flower very early in the spring, not quite as early as crocus, but give it a couple weeks and then they're up. But what they have going for them is that they tolerate really compacted, poor soils. They like disturbance and they spread aggressively. So in the planter situation, like at Richardson, I'm not concerned with them spreading aggressively because they aren't being disturbed. So they're not getting compaction, they're not getting walked upon. But if you're putting this on, say, a walkway or the edge of one of our ponds up against the sidewalk, or in a bare spot on a reclaimed site, these guys will be able to fill in. Field pussy toes are just one of them. Manitoba, we have 4 or 5 different species of pussy toes. Some of them are available for purchase. They don't grow very easily from seed, so if you can get an actual plug of them, that's your best bet. But these guys are also the host plants to swallowtail butterflies, so they provide advantage in that perspective also. Prairie crocus, provincial flower of Manitoba, so significant in that aspect, very early flowering. Pollinators love tubes and they love purple flowers. So a purple flower with a yellow center is like a pollinator flag. So they are very important in the springtime when it comes to getting plants going, and pollinators going and getting them excited for the season. The advantage of these guys is they have that purple flower in the spring, but as soon as then the seed head is quite hilarious looking, I find. So it's really showy. And once that seed head is done, then the leaves spread out and they create this really, really beautiful matrix of green. And so they provide cover on the ground through the whole season, not just when they're in this pretty flower form. And then their seed grows quite easily. So they spread quite easily on a site. And they don't need much. They tolerate dry conditions and are quite adaptable. Billardia is just beautiful. It is a little bit of a later succession plant than its compadre black-eyed Susans. So black-eyed Susans can generally live 3 to 5 years. These guys are looking at 5 to 7 for a specific plant, if not longer. Their seed also lasts longer in the soil, so it'll last dormant longer. So it has advantages there. It's more robust than a black-eyed Susan, so the stem itself is more likely to stay up, whereas if you're using a black-eyed Susan in any kind of landscape format, it tends to get really droopy because you're giving it everything it needs, and then it just grows really fast, and it grows too fast for what it can handle. So I really like Gaillardia, and it's pretty suitable in many environments, and it's really adaptable to a lot of soil conditions as well. Prairie onion, other than being gorgeous, it is, again, culturally significant. It can grow in really poor soils. In Manitoba, we see it surely amongst, the tallgrass prairie and in the rich, dark soils. But if you get in a canoe and you head out into the Whiteshell, you'll find another type of onion, but similarly, just sitting on the rocks. Grows really well through seed. One of the disadvantages of this is that because it looks like a grass when it's not in flower, it can get weeded out by people, or during your weed management efforts, it can be targeted. So you have to be aware of that. But that being said, once that flower shows, it's pretty remarkable. And again, really great for pollinators. Canada wild rye. One of my favorites, but I say that about everything. it's just really pretty. It's nice and tall. It gets very graceful in the fall. It tolerates a wider regime of shade, so it prefers to not be on sunny slopes. If you put it on sunny slopes, though, as is erosion control, it quickly establishes, but then it only lives about 3 to 5-ish years depending. So it doesn't, in the wild, it doesn't grow in a big clump, but you can do that on a site for erosion control in the first couple of years while you wait for something else to fill in those gaps. So that's the advantage of this one. The blue stem, I mentioned it before, but it provides probably the most showiest colors and displays compared to any other species that we have in Manitoba, at least. I mean, big blue stem is definitely colorful, but it doesn't get these silver fluffs. This is zoomed in quite a bit, and this is one you're probably familiar with. It really loves dry soils, but it also can handle some saltiness, but not lots. But you can use this on some sites that are close to roadways, which might be disturbed, and it grows really well through seed, quite aggressively and quite quickly. So even if you're on your sites and you're not collecting seed, you can just walk through this stuff and disperse it, and it'll start to spread. So be like the bison and just walk. Then this guy, purple prairie clover, I think is one that everyone's pretty familiar with. Really great for pollinators. Again, purple is the color that they like. Really small footprint, so it doesn't take a lot. The thing is, these ones don't do as well from transplants. They do better from seed, but you have to be more patient with them. Their taproot doesn't do well when you transplant it. They're really sensitive. So if you can grow this from seed, that's your best bet. Again, they tolerate a wide variety of soil conditions. And if you're going to seed these guys and you really want them to grow in that first year, you should scarify the seed coat. So you have to prepare it a little bit. Otherwise, you should know that it likely won't flower within 2 to 3 years. But once it's there for good. And then we got June grass, which again, this is zoomed in quite a bit. But what I love about this one, it's very quick to get going. It doesn't take a lot of effort to grow this plant. It grows really well from seed. In terms of its appearance, it starts that season off really tight and really green. When it flowers like this in June, it gets quite silver and green, and then a little bit of a red tinge to them. And then as the season progresses even further, it gets into kind of a loose panicle, but it's a very gold color. So it's very variable through the season, which is nice. So it makes a really good host plant for nesting habitat for a lot of bumblebees, because they really like bunch grasses. And so these provide a really good bunch earlier in the season. And it's just
this one. I think I just joined this one chat.
So I think that's it for this part of it before we get into what we're doing for the case study. I have time for questions, I think.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much, Brianna. That was a really great presentation, and your photos are beautiful. I don't know how you get so many good pictures of bees. I think my hands are too shaky. They might always end up blurry. To our attendees out there, if you have any questions, just type it into the chat box or the Q&A. Oh, there isn't a Q&A because this is a meeting, not a webinar. So just type into the chat section, and we'll see if anyone has any questions. Let's see here. Oh, why seeds versus plants at the house? From Heather.
Because we wanted everything to be going at the same rate. So we were only on this project for 2 years. It's easier to manage if everything on a 2-year scale, if everything was by seed. If we were having to deal with plant plugs, we have to find space for them, and we would be providing a disadvantage to the grasses that we were trying to establish. And then because it was a homeowner, the cost was included in the decision-making process. So seed we had available. And I think that was pretty much the the guiding decisions there. We could get more bang for our buck with seeds on this one.
That makes sense. What resources do you use to find out whether seed or seedlings work better for transplant establishment?
Other than trial and error, there's a plant propagation database that I like to look for, which I can provide a link after in the chat. On the case study scenarios, there's a link to the Ladybird Wildlife Organization, and she has really good data. And there's a couple more resources there. And just kind of knowing the nature of the plants, spending a lot of time looking at them, knowing and just trying it out and seeing what works.
For sure, that makes sense. If you had to top 6 species to choose and your goal was ease of establishment and hardy low maintenance, what would you choose?
I'd have to ask what low maintenance means, but in terms of forbs, I guess, is more so. Northern bedstraw is great. Yarrow. If I want cover, then wild strawberries are great because they are just gorgeous. They have a nice red berry, and then they are great for snacking and great for pollinators. The meadow blazing stars are great, really great for pollinators. A little bit harder to establish because they don't flower, and at the first year they look like a grass, so they occasionally get pulled, so that's a little bit challenging. Oh boy. And then I don't low maintenance. Oh boy. Probably one of the prairie clovers. So depending on your site conditions, white prairie clover is good for a drier, rockier, more disturbed site. Purple prairie clover will still grow there, but not be as successful in the long run, but super low maintenance.
Awesome. Would a species like the Canada wild rye reproduce and regrow from seed on its own on your site once it's established?
It does, but
cool.
it doesn't. It doesn't spread as aggressively as you seed it. So not all the seeds are viable because they're such a sought after food for insects and for wildlife. So oftentimes they're also susceptible to ergot. So on a seed head, not all of the seeds are viable, unlike a lot of other plants. So yeah, it just doesn't tend to grow as aggressively from seed.
That makes sense. We have a couple questions regarding maintenance. So what maintenance do you recommend to keep grasses from crowding out the flowers?
Yeah, I recommend when you initially seed, if you're doing an initial seeding, that you seed your grasses at a lower rate. So that's a good way to start off. If your goal is to have a lot of forbs and forb diversity, you have to fill those niches before you give the grasses the opportunity to do that. But once it's established in there, making sure, if depending on the size of your project, if you can get in there and pluck seed heads off and spread them, that's also a really great way to do that. Like seed heads of the flowers. So black-eyed Susans, if you have those, they grow very well from seed. So if you just rip off a head and walk around and spread, that's a really great way to avoid the grass seeds from getting incorporated into the soil, because generally the forb seeds don't need to go as deep into the soil. So grass seeds are a little bit more finicky and they need to be displaced further down and get more cover. So as long as you can just spread the forb seeds over top, you're more likely to have success growing them.
Okay, that makes sense. What maintenance considerations should be taken in the later years to ensure the longevity of the site in an urban environment, like 10 plus years?
Yeah, in an urban environment, I guess, depending on the size of the project, if you can burn it, and then if you already have a problem with thatch control and too many grasses growing and not enough forb diversity, then you should be able to, then you should go into the site and reseed your forbs in order to make sure that there's success. But burning it or grazing it or haying it and raking up that material, the biggest deterrent for growing those forbs is the thatch that's on there. And coming from Manitoba, when you have big blue stem, it really doesn't take long for that thatch to develop. So that's your goal.
Thanks. And then the last question for right now, I read that June grass is short-lived in clay soils. This comment was from the US source. What is your experience?
A similar. It doesn't, you have to imagine too, like the June grass isn't a riverbank species, and so it wouldn't generally grow there. It's not its conditions that it likes. It likes to be in that drier, not dry prairie, but not moist prairie. So it doesn't like clay soils. It just, you can put it there, but it won't have a good survivorship.
That makes sense. Thanks. We're just after 2 o'clock, so I want to give everyone a 5-minute bio break before we go into our groups, if that's all right. So if everyone wants to grab a cup of water, use the loo, whatever you'd like to do, we'll reconvene at 2:05. So we'll give everyone a few minutes. And then Brianna, while we're waiting for everyone, if you want to break too, go for it. There's still a few questions there we didn't have time for, so if you want to type in some answers into the chat box, go for it.
Okay.
There we go. Do you want to explain the next part of the case study then?
Yes, and just okay.
Perfect. Thank you for doing that. There was quite a few in there. It's great to have discussion.
Yeah, it is. I love to talk about plants.
This is the right group for it.
Yes. So if everyone, yeah, we're all good. So the idea here, maybe I can share this screen. We're going to break up into groups and we're going to kind of go through some scenarios. So depending on the size of the groups, I'm not sure where we're at with numbers and stuff, but we're going to try to make them bigger. I've given you sort of a rough outline of how we're going to make the planting plans work. So there's a little bit of budgeting that's involved. But again, the focus here is species list. So I don't necessarily need you to be calculating everything out specifically, but just keep it in mind. So if you know you're $1 million over budget, address that and you know why. So there's some discussion points that I've highlighted here that we can talk about after. I've provided a species list, but just use it as a guideline. This is not an all-encompassing list. There's many more out there. I just wanted to give you something to work off of. There's 4 scenarios, so we'll start with 2 and see how far we get. Within your groups, you can pick any of the 4 to choose from, whichever ones suit your group best. And then once we've done 2 of them, we'll see what time we're at, and if we need to just meet up and discuss as a group everything. So we have till 3:30. So yeah, we'll see how it goes. And I'll just kind of jump in. I think Caitlin will jump into groups as we see fit. So
perfect. Thank you, Brianna. I just want to let everyone know that if you have not downloaded the handout yet, just scroll down on FeedLoop. It's right here in session 10. Just scroll right down to the bottom and you will see native plant selection scenario. So that's the handout that you need. And I've learned from past case studies, it's better if you get the handout now before we send you off into a group, because I may not remember which group I put you in.
Oh, and make sure someone is a designated recorder, designer, and then someone will be reporting as the on behalf of the group. So kind of establish that right in the beginning, and then it'll make the whole rest of the process easier.
Perfect. That's a great point. So is everyone ready to go to groups? I think so. And I'm going to stop the recording so that way everyone can turn on their webcams and unmute themselves. And we will continue the recording part at the end for the recap. So,
any foxtail barley in their projects?
No.
No. We didn't put Canada thistle in either.
That one
You gotta
might
have a
just get
little bit
there.
of foxtail to make sure you don't have full failure.
Yeah. Oh no. Good time. Which scenarios have you guys worked through already?
Wow.
Half the scenario.
Yeah, we got halfway through one.
Okay. Yeah, we worked our way through the roundabout scenario, which is I think number 4. But then I think Caitlin, we can just split back into groups and keep at her.
sure. I think I can put everyone back into the same group. So
Ooh.
Are we considering like labor costs and equipment in this, or just the costs of seed?
Yeah. Yes and no.
Okay.
Like, again, the budget is a little concern. Know that you're not going to be out there hand pulling weeds on a 15-acre site. Like, that's not feasible. But what is feasible and manageable within the budget, kind of, sort of.
Okay.
okay, I'll send everyone back and stop the recording.
There we go, in progress. So I'll just go from these discussion points and then we'll just leave the conversation wherever it goes. So we'll start with, what plants did you discuss most in your groups? Was there one that kind of kept on coming up, either negatively or positively, or that you were confused about or wasn't really sure where it would fit into the whole scheme of things?
Why was Canada thistle there?
Just as a joke. So you would know, just because it says Canada doesn't mean that it's a native and it should belongs here.
Okay.
There's a movement, I think, by some biologists to change that name to creeping thistle or something else. But yeah.
You're here.
What about foxtail barley? I'd like to know the consensus on that one.
Didn't use it. I don't like to plant it, but it is native in the parkland region.
Yeah.
It'd be maybe okay for a saline area, but definitely not for an area with near dog park, because the seeds can get stuck in dogs' noses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of those ones that's a native, but we don't treat it. We treat it as a weedy species in our projects, so we don't put it there. It just shows up.
What do you think about, so we did the scenario 2 with the 1 acre wetland. What do you think about including it in that mix?
Including what?
Including foxtail in a slough grass mix.
I wouldn't. Again, I think it would show up on its own, but in a slough like that, it likely would just spread and take over everything. And there are certainly like more suitable, like the tufted hair grass or the calamagrostis or the slough grass, that would do better in those conditions and not end up being as weedy. So yeah, I still would not intentionally put it in anything.
One of our questions was early blue violet. We decided that Western Canada and downy yellow likely would not take a full sun. And so the question was, while we were going to do just a few early blue violets, but I'm wondering if you have experience with that. And the reason we wanted the violets is that this was an urban Winnipeg park and you need violets for fritillary butterflies. So that's why the effort to put some in. What's your experience?
It You were right with the downy yellow in Canada preferring more shady. So that's great. Downy yellow really likes forested and more moist. And then Canada violet, you find more boreal or, again, wet. Early blue violet really likes it not as dry as crowfoot violet. Crowfoot violet is less commercially available though, but early blue violet, the advantage of him is it can flower a couple times a year, and then it seeds itself very well, very quickly and very easily. So it spreads nicely, and is quite low maintenance. It likes full sun, can tolerate not full sun, partially shady. So it has advantages there. And it is more creeping than some of the other violets, as opposed to like crowfoot, which kind of stays very stationary. Early blue violet will spread out. So that's the advantage there for that one. Pretty.
Crowfoot wasn't on the list.
No, it wasn't. It's just another violet that kind of fits the same niche, but has different leaves. The crowfoot violet leaves look like a crowfoot, more similar to the crocus leaves or cutleaf anemone leaves.
Okay.
We kind of ran into the knowing what's in the surrounding area would help decide your seed mix as well. Like, yeah, like based on, you'd pick your willows based on what else is around there, or 100%.
Yeah,
what else? Well, some of those weedier type wetland species that might sneak in on their own.
Yeah, you're very right with that. There's no sense in putting tall grass prairie plants on a riverbank if they just naturally wouldn't exist there. So you save yourself the effort of researching and trying to fight against nature. It's much easier just to go with what is already competitive in the environment, and then what will have that advantage on site, for sure. So that's probably the best starting point, is looking at your site and then what's next to it. How about budget? Did that come into anyone? Did anyone have real troubles with figuring that you were going to spend $1 million more than what you wanted to?
Not really for us, but I think that's partially because we didn't get a chance to dive in maybe into what labor or soil amendments or machinery, all of that would cost. Getting plant plugs 70 for $132, because we weren't sure of these areas either. Like in the dog park, we weren't sure how much of an area we had to cover. Yeah. So I think we were under budget in that sense, but probably really tight if we consider those other things.
Yeah. Staff time ends up being where all of your money goes to, which is just kind of a pain. Because you love doing what you're doing and you want to do it well, but you know that you're where the money's going.
Well,
and then volunteers are great, but there's training involved. And I mean, as someone who did volunteering to do planting, there's also, you have to supply them with shovels and, make sure they know what they're doing. It takes time.
Yeah. And the Richardson project was supposed to be a volunteer planting event, but then COVID happened. So we couldn't have people on site doing that. But that was the original plan, was to have the community involved as much as possible, which is also great to get engagement in the projects, and especially if they're in the community. If you can get volunteers on site, it's great. But then you need snacks, you need safety. And sometimes people bail last minute. You never really know how many people you're going to get, and it becomes hard to budget from that sense. So it's great in some regards, but then it can be challenging still from a management perspective.
We definitely had a budget issue on ours, because we had to cover 3,000 or 3 acres, which is about a little over 3,000 square meters. And so I threw out a creative idea, and I couldn't believe that my group didn't think it was so far-fetched. And I guess it's because I've planted lots of tulips in the past, and you have this sort of contraction to try to get the plug of soil out in order to put the tulip in. And the same thing with dandelions, right? You have a dandelion weeder. So we would try to find some sort of contraption that digs out our native prairie, and then we're selling our native prairie grasses to group 4. So group 4 out there, we have a good deal for you. And because group 4, I think, had $15,000 and we only had $10,000. So we're going to make money in order to, complete our project. So how wild an idea was that? Have you ever tried that in any of your projects?
I have.
Because we want to put in plugs, right? Because seeding a native prairie, we were not going to get a lot of success. So there was quite a bit of discussion how, we'd put seed out and would any of it take on an existing prairie grass situation. So
yeah, it's a clever idea, but you have to consider that the tall grass prairie, as tall as it is above ground, it's double that below ground.
Yes.
So you can only cut off a portion of those roots and hope that it'll survive. I've split up big blue stem chunks, but using a handsaw. So you can't just take a shovel at it. You have to be pretty aggressive, and it's labor intensive. Some species it would work with, like big blue stem or blue grama and side oats. But even as something like June grass, unless your soil is very loose, I still don't know that you would quickly be able to kind of clump it, grab it, and pull it out, just because they're that dense of a bunch grass. So I've had a little bit of success, but only on a project that was 1 or 2 years old. Anything past the 2-year age range, the roots are too far established for it to just be easily transported, like in a plug, like you're suggesting. Yeah.
So then plan B, which is probably the better idea, was to just choose 5 areas and concentrate the pollinators. That's what one person suggested, so that you would have that visual effect. It was an urban situation. And so that's what we would have ended up doing.
Yeah, and I think that is the way to go. For many reasons. It makes watering easier. It makes weed control easier. You can, if you're worried that dogs are running or rabbits are coming in and chewing, or deer are coming in and chewing, you can close that section off. Theoretically, you can fence it off if you really need to for a while. So yeah, sometimes the smaller is better because it's more manageable. So as much as we would hope to see a big prairie with lots of flowers growing over that whole, 3 acres, yeah, feasibly, it makes much more sense to do a smaller scale, little spots. Yeah. What were the greatest difficulties in determining your species composition? Let's try that one.
I think for us, because ours was in a public area, it was the roundabout within town limits. Some of the things that we came up with was salinity, sight lines as well, and nothing could be really too big because you have to look around the roundabout. And then also like the public image of what's a weedy species and what's not. Someone could look at that roundabout and go, oh, that's just a bunch of weeds, when really it's native plants. So that was something that we kind of had to look around and figure out what we could plant despite those conditions.
Yeah, that's certainly the urban setting, even though historically tall grass prairie or mixed grass prairie, whatever it is, but you're putting stuff into a non-native setting, regardless of its historical use once you're in a constructed area. So there's definitely different characteristics that you have to consider. There's a message that came in the chat. Are there plants that are good for dealing with contaminants? And there certainly are, but it's specific. So you'd have to do your research and look into it. So depending on well, I mean, there's a threshold level that nothing will be able to handle, but there's certainly stuff that can clean up soil or contaminants more than others, that are better at it and will have a better survivorship than others for sure. But like I said, quite specific, so you'd have to be more specific about which contaminants and the concentration that you're trying to clean up.
I think to come back to the difficulty of species composition, our group struggled with not having your breadth of knowledge with what works better as a seed and what works better as a plug, and the timing for flowers. And I mean, we had definitely some very knowledgeable people about pollinators or when things flowered, but the planting aspect of it and designing it, I think, is such a specialty that we kind of just were like, well, get a list of species and see what happens.
Yeah, it's definitely a like a moving Jenga puzzle some days. So it's fun problem solving, but it's complicated. and it's kind of, you know, you think it's intuitively it's just wildflowers and they just need to grow. You just put the seed down and they'll be happy. But realistically, even in a remnant prairie, it's existed as it has for 10,000 years. So it didn't just get thrown down and find its balance and didn't become this perfect equilibrium all on its own in 3 years, right? Which is what we kind of expect and we kind of hope for when we design our, like collectively, when we design the seed mixes for reclaimed sites or for projects. So yeah, it's challenging. It's more than just plants in the ground.
For sure. And we also were wondering, do you have any experience with planting back carex into like wetland sites or sourcing those seeds or?
Yeah, so we do at NPS, we actually do a pretty extensive wetland seed collecting program every year. And then we clean seed because it's not commercially available. So we take that on ourselves to do that in-house for our projects that we have the seed available. So yeah, as specialized as the prairie knowledge is, and that's much more available on the internet and from experts that have done it. The wetland seed is a whole other can of worms that's, I think, a little bit more challenging just because it's not as, it's not done on the scale as the prairie seeds are done, so.
How would you plant into a wetland? Like for us, where we had a seasonally dry area, how would you deal with that?
It depends on what your seed mix ended up being. So on a seasonally wet, you likely would have kind of that wetland mosaic species. So you might have some dry upland species and then you have wetter species. The trick is not seeding it once. The best way I think to go at that is to do it kind of multiple times, 2 or 3 times, so that your soil either has the right moisture retention. Some of those seeds need the dormancy over winter. Some of them do better if they touch the ground and grow in right away. They don't need a lot of gratification, like they don't need that time. So there's that. Broadcast seeding. It's difficult to get equipment in there unless it's really dry. So there's that. But then you still have to incorporate it into the ground somehow for some species. And some of them are just more tricky to get in. Prairie cordgrass doesn't do well from seed. It takes a while to get there. Cattails, even despite the plethora of seeds that are on a cattail seed head, 99.9% of those aren't viable. They require some processing. So that's why it's not really, like, for as many cattails as there are out there, look at how many seeds are out there. And why the world isn't covered in cattails is because those seeds require some pretty significant care before they become cattails. So yeah, maybe that answers your question.
In our group, we had a few people who seemed to know which of the ones on your list would do better as seed. And I'm going to just read them out to you. And then I'm going to ask you, if we had seeded that native prairie with these plants, would we have had any success? So it was yarrow, giant hyssop, harebell, yellow coneflower, black-eyed Susans, prairie goldenrod, and I think it was either lindleys or smooth aster. I can't see where mine are going. That we thought, oh, and the Alexanders that we were going to do with seed, and the rest we were going to do with plugs. So was that a good list? And has that been successful at all in an established grass prairie?
Yeah, I'd say you were the pretty good list there for seeding. Hyssop, for sure. The two that I just kind of wrote down, harebell is a little bit more challenging in an established, like really grassy area because the seeds are so tiny. So they don't get, you have to ensure that all the seeds get soil contact, and if they don't, then they're not going to grow. So that's the only concern with the harebells. Yeah, and then everything else I think would be okay. The goldenrod, only because again it needs that soil to seed contact, and its seeds are so tiny. So the smaller the seed, kind of the harder it is to establish in a big prairie, or in an area that's very covered in grass. But you know, black-eyed Susans, the Alexanders, those seeds are big and dark, so they have an advantage of heating up quick and getting to the soil where they need to go. So those ones are easy. Yellow coneflower, for sure, same thing. So
and would you use a sand or something else to put the seed in? There's a name for it, but I've forgotten what that is. When you mix it in with another,
yeah,
I'm saying sand, but it might not be sand, whatever you're using.
Yeah, I do that just so I get even spread of seeds, because they are costly and expensive and hard to see because they're so tiny. Yeah, I would mix it in like we use Pro Mix just so that it distributes the seed easily through. Yeah, but you don't have to. It just makes it easier.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to go back to when you talked about seeding a wetland multiple times. Are you suggesting that like you would seed it once a year, like for 3 years, or were you saying like it would be like multiple times within the same year, the same season?
Yeah, within the same season, because you kind of want to get the seeds where they need to be in the right zone. So kind of at your full water and then your low water, and then there's the kind of that middle muddy section that would be there. So that's what I would do multiple times.
Okay.
So you kind of ration out your seed.
Wet areas in the Southwest are packed full of super rare plants. Have you ever tried to do anything with rare plant restoration?
Yes and no. Like Western silvery aster is one that's commercially available, so we've put that into the planters at Richardson. I won't dig up a rare plant, and I will not collect seed unless I see a lot of them, and even then, likely not. So for the scale of projects that we do and the work we do, we don't. But some of the grass seed that we get, like green needlegrass, I think is an S3 ranked species in Manitoba. So it's not a rare species, but it's on that we need to watch out for it list. And so, you know, that one's in all of our mixes. Buffalo grass is an S2, I think. Yeah, go ahead, Caitlin.
Sorry to interrupt. It's 3:30 and we have to head over to the next session for the wrap up and the announcement about who wins the grant. So thank you so much, Brianna, for leading such an amazing case study and all the fantastic discussion afterwards. It was really great. And thanks everyone for being so engaged. And we'll see everyone over on the next session. So thank you.